Alright, so this is another one that was requested a while back, and people have been throwing out Cape Fear to me a few times now. And I do think that this one is appropriate enough. It might seem kind of weird to not be talking about the original Cape Fear, since that would mean both killers we're talking about are played by Mitchum. But the thing is not only was this one suggested, but I also just think that, frankly, Scorsese's movie is just more interesting. And kind of has a bit more to say about its material and kind of going on with it, whereas the original from '62 kind of felt a bit more straightforward about itself. So with Scorsese kind of getting to take on like his usual anti-hero thing and be able to put it in a movie like this, I just kind of find infinitely more interesting at the end of the day. But yeah, so obviously we're looking at a battle here of Bible quoting, stalking psychopaths. Like I said, one of which is played by Robert Mitchum, and one that once was. The Mitchum is still in the movie, but I think actually I want to start with The Night of the Hunter. We'll kind of go chronologically here. Which even before the original Cape Fear in 1955, when this came out, immediately brought up in a number of conversations, whether it be, noir movies or even horror movies, really, even though I know a lot of people have trouble even, like, categorizing it, because it kind of falls into the thriller category mainly, I guess, despite the fact that it is considered, Harry Powell especially is considered, like, one of the scariest movie villains ever, for good reason, which almost immediately kind of feels like it's in the horror category, despite also some genuinely horror-like imagery that goes along with it, and just the sort of nightmarish quality to it in general. It's also brought up as far as directors that didn't really have vast filmographies, or directors that made a splash with just one movie. And that would be Charles Lawton, the actor, directing this, and this being his only movie, which was really interesting because you would think, and yeah, if I remember correctly, it kind of failed. It was one of those movies that failed at the time, kind of like the thing we just talked about. But it did kind of have like such artistic value to it, and I think that's why it stands out so much in regards to you watch it and you think, wow, he only did this once. But there's a number of things that must have gone into that. And it is a case of, despite the fact that Max Cady is a fictional character, though both of these are based on books, with Cape Fear's book being called The Executioner. While The Night of the Hunter is based on a novel, it is to my understanding that Harry Powell is still based on somebody that was real in like the 30s. I think his name was Harry Powers, which is close enough, and met pretty much the same fate in regards to being hung in the prison in Moundsville. So I'm not quite sure like how deep in detail that story goes in regards to what we see here, but it is an interesting case of, I guess there was a lot of feuding over the screenplay and who was like getting credit for it, because the credited screenwriter, apparently many people will dispute his work, but what's interesting about that is the fact that when you actually read the novel, it's pretty much like a direct adaptation. I don't just mean that in like, oh, they're relatively similar. It's practically word for word, like just straight out of the book. Like it's as close to an adaptation of the book as like True Grit, and it's either True Grit, and it's yeah. So you could actually like watch it as you can look at the novel as you watch the movie, almost as if you're looking at a script. Like that's how close it is. So whatever that battle was, it's really kind of a moot point. And I guess there's a few interesting background things. One thing that always kind of weirded me out, before even going into the movie itself, was when you look at the child actors who are amazing in this, who play the characters John and Pearl. This is really kind of irrelevant, but it's just something that kind of has always been eerie to me. There is, I believe the actress that played Pearl was never in anything again, or maybe was an extra in something once, apart from that. And then the kid that played John kept acting until, like, 1959, which was, like, 4 years after this, and then just kind of quit, and then eventually died in 2016. And he died on December 2nd, which is the birthday of the actress that played Pearl. So like I don't know how you want to take that, but it's always stuff like that, especially surrounding a movie that's already kind of eerie as it is. Just kind of always adds to that. It just adds a little something from real life to kind of loom over it. And so that's the case with this. Sort of like what was it? I think it was Black Orpheus, where it's a movie actually about death, and the two main actors in it died many like years later, like decades later, only like days apart. And it was so stuff like that always kind of is great in setting the tone unintentionally. So there's that. But when you talk about the book, something that the movie does differently that I like is that we are introduced to basically the movie itself through Powell's character, where he's just kind of in the story. Like I think it's when he's actually in the prison is when we kind of first meet him in the book. We kind of get his backstory afterwards, but yeah. So just following him at the very start, and it's the way we kind of start off with the Bible verses talking about the false prophets and the wolf in sheep's clothing and stuff like that. There's so many things that you could bring into this about like real life stuff that we're still seeing now in like the age of like mega churches and stuff like that. And it's like the fact that this is very much a real thing. These preacher types that kind of take on this, almost use that as like a facade. And then we kind of get to delve into the darkness of this. But the interesting thing about that is how he's still, it's basically a facade, but he's still in that vein of, he's under the impression that God is helping him through this and basically pointing him in the direction of killing the people that he kills for the reasons that he kills them. He's under the impression that he's like cleansing like society or something. He's talking about how, you know, there's just so much of these dirty kinds of people in this world that I can't kill them all because I can't kill the world. And it's and we really see the darkness of this character just right away, which is really interesting because it's when we see him, like when he's just out driving around, even though he's speaking out loud supposedly to God about this, there's just something so, like, if you're on the outskirts of it, it would just look normal. Like, he would look like any other kind of person. Yet he's speaking practically out loud about these horrific things that he's not only doing, but has been doing for apparently quite some time. Where we get a glimpse at the very end just how many times he's probably done this. At least that's how many times he got caught doing it, that they were able to trace it back. But it's... so it could be even more than that. And of course, it's with the way Mitchum carries this that is going to be a large portion of the life of this movie. I feel like in another case, usually with movies like this, you could say he completely, entirely has to... like, if it were a case of, if it wasn't for his performance working, the entire movie wouldn't work. I don't know, because the way it just kind of looks is such its own thing, but we'll get into that. But to go into this also, it is to my understanding that not only was this kind of a different kind of character for him, by far, as it probably would have been for about any actor in the 50s, it's not only did he carry it so well, but it's to my understanding that both he and Shelley Winters, like, looked back on this movie with such, like, pride. Like, he considered it, like, one of his best movies and one of his best performances, if not the best of both of those. And the fact that they were able to praise it, even despite the fact that it was seen as maybe, like, a failure at the time, kind of shows you... that's usually the telling sign, first off, when, like, the actors or whoever worked on it genuinely stand by it, where you kind of get the sense of maybe it'll eventually find a following, and to say that that happened for this movie is, to say the least. But, yeah, really just the way that it's, not only, like, everything about that also, but there's also the way he's described in the book. It almost feels like it was always intended to somehow be Mitchum. Like, somehow there was a crystal ball while the book was being written. Because I think they describe him as having, like, flashing eyes and a rolling, booming voice. And it's like, if that's, especially rolling, booming voice, if that's not Mitchum in the 50s, I don't know what is. It was even Mitchum in the early 90s, really, as we see in Cape Fear, but... Yeah, so talking about how this movie is pretty straightforward as far as being, like I said, it's a guy that, you know, clearly thinks he's talking to God and being moved by God or whatever, but for the most part, we're in a pretty simple kind of story where it's just one guy that wants one thing and is going to do these particular tasks to get that. To say tasks makes it sound simple. Yeah, it's to fall into this family and somehow marry Peter Grace's wife, Peter Grace, who robbed a bank and inadvertently killed one or two people, possibly. Possibly inadvertently. He definitely did kill them. And then comes home and hides the money with his children, who are the only ones that know. So, of course, he has to fall in with the wife and be the new stepfather, and that is his elaborate plan to get this money, which is perfect for him because that's pretty much already what he was doing anyway. So it's like he's saying, you know, God, there is no way the stars aligned this much. This is definitely your doing. And so that driving force. The fact that that's the thing is the fact that it sounds crazy for him to say, "Oh, I'm being directed by a higher power, and a higher power is pointing me in the right direction," and it's almost proving him right that things lined up so perfectly in this scenario. So that in itself is weird. But the idea of it taking on an almost kind of supernatural vibe. And obviously, there's not anything actually supernatural in the story, but there are things that absolutely have a supernatural feel, which really bring in the horror of the whole situation. There is a moment in the book where they use Willa and Isa use the whole. They go through the idea of using a Ouija board to decide what her future may or may not be following her husband's execution. And even though she's not entirely into this, they go ahead and do it anyway. And the Ouija board ends up spelling out cloth, meaning her next husband, and obviously that lines up in a way. But but the movie replaces this, and probably for the better, because that would have trying to possibly bring in like anything like the audience would have absolutely run with the whole thing being supernatural. I feel like if they had actually kept that scene in. So the movie replaces that with just these shots that keep cutting back and forth between the two of them talking about how, like, you know, you need to find a husband and stuff like that. And it's these dooming shots of this train approaching. And the train itself just looks like death. It's completely black against a white background, and it's got the smoke, and just everything about it is dooming, and we keep cutting back to it every time it's brought up that Willa needs another man in her life. And I feel like that in itself completely sets up the dooming nature of all this that's about to happen. But as we were talking about later on, it does feel more like when they're like after Willa's been killed and the kids escape and they're running away and they're trying to evade Powell. He just seems like he's constantly in the background, and it's like no matter how far they go or how far ahead of him they seem to get, his like very distant silhouette will always be there. And it does feel like they're almost being haunted by like a supernatural force the way that keeps going on. So the way they're able to do that without actually delving into the supernatural is just incredible. I love when any movie does that, and this one does it just as well as any ever has. Not just in the sense of it when you explain what's going on, but the imagery that goes with it is unparalleled. So there's that. And talking about that also, there is some terrifying imagery in this. I don't know about the rest of you, but one of the things that always absolutely terrified me as a child was windows, particularly the windows in my own bedroom, because you always get the sense that something could just be there. And long before I even saw this movie, one of my absolute fears was laying in bed at night in the dark and potentially seeing a shadow from said window. Long before I even saw this movie. So, so when Powell's shadow first hits the wall, and he's a pretty far distance from the house, it seems, when you look out the window, even though he's right outside the fence. But that shadow is so confronting. And then just look, like, the shot of him outside is creepy enough when he's, like, by the lantern and all that. and singing "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms," which he does throughout it in the most creepy way possible. Um, but that is so supposedly unassuming that John doesn't even pay it any mind. He's like, oh, it's just a dude outside. So the terrifying thing was the shadow more so than actually seeing the man himself, which I think really says something. Though, unlike John, I would have been just as petrified if it was, a dude in a creepy hat with a creepy singing voice just standing out by the lantern, and God knows what time it was at this point. Very late. But, yeah, and stuff like that. Like, just that imagery alone, like, just the simplicity of it, of, like, only seeing, Pal standing there, the fence, and the lamp, and that's about it. Like, everything else is just, like, this vast darkness, and it's, like, it is like the image out of a dream, or more appropriately, a nightmare. And that they're able to keep that so consistent, because the cinematographer on this was Stanley Cortez, who is probably most well known for having done The Magnificent Ambersons for Orson Welles. And if I'm not misquoting or misremembering, he was actually quoted once as saying that of all the movies he worked on, which was quite a bit, that there were only two directors he ever worked with that he felt understood lighting on, like, a whole other level than anybody else in the industry. And he said that was Wells and it was Charles Lawton for this movie. And I mean, I love his work with Wells and everything, but I would almost argue that The Night of the Hunter had to be the work of his career, because the imagery in this movie is just so nearly indescribable. I'm going to do my best, but yeah. But before we go into that, another thing is kind of the rest of the characters, which would be particularly Shelley Winters as well, who's pretty much perfect, almost infuriatingly perfect, because it's that case of she seems so oblivious, but in such kind of a weirdly believable way, like the way you would see somebody, kind of like watching somebody fall into a cult is basically what it looks like, what this performance appears to be. Where he's able to gaslight her, and she's able to think, like, because, my previous husband brought me this money, and the fact that I was even going to accept it, like, it's this horrible thing, and he brought this evil into our lives by doing that, and stuff like that. And it's so creepy to watch her watch her mind change in real time as he is getting inside of it. It's like it's such an innocent but such a creepy performance because of how well that is portrayed. We even get that moment at the beginning that is towards the beginning of their marriage, on their wedding night, before she is horribly rejected by him in the bedroom, which has always been a hard scene to watch. But she is so oblivious. There is that one moment that seems so normal and whatever if you don't know the context. When his jacket's hanging on the door and she takes out the knife. And she's like, oh, he carries around a knife. Men. It's like, that's such a man thing to do. And then she just puts it back, and that's just all that is. And it's like, to think that that is the weapon that kills her, and that was her only reaction to it when she first saw it, is so skin and crawl. To just be so nonchalant about the thing that's going to end your life, whether you know that or not. And the fact that it's so even the way it's shown in the movie is just so casual, just makes it even creepier. And so, yeah, so as short-lived as it is, I really love what Shelley Winters brought to this, especially the moments when when she starts to kind of see that there's something wrong with the way that he's talking to the children, even though it's very, very short-lived. It's like her very last moments are like, oh, there might be something off about this guy. I don't know. And before anything can happen, and that's the thing, too, is you don't expect that to happen near as early as it does. And if you expect it to happen at all, because she is the mother of the children, and the father is obviously gone, you may not expect that death at all, let alone as early as it is. She was like, she was almost Janet Leigh before Janet Leigh was, 5 years before. And then, and not only that is that jarring, but the reveal where she's underwater, still in the car, and there's just the image of it with like her hair and the seaweed and how white it looks. Like it's so ghostly. Like I said, it's so there's so many things in this that just have a genuinely like supernatural feel to them. Just whether even that's the intention or not, I don't know. But that's the vibe I get, and it's really and of course the fact that the way the scene dissolves, her underwater, and the way her hair flows and everything, as it dissolves into the next scene, his singing starts to take over this image, is played over this image before it goes into the next scene. It's scary as that's really all it is. And there's even their bedroom setting. And I was talking about the scene where she's well, not really the scene where she's rejected, but the scene where he kills her. We get a really good shot of the room, and it's like even though it's like perfectly sums up his character, this setting. Even though it's her bedroom, now that it's become their bedroom, it's suddenly much creepier. And when we get this full big shot of it, it's sort of like it kind of looks like the inside of a church, but it at the same time looks like it could be a set on the original Nosferatu. And it's so and combining those two things is it's just so incredibly eerie. But like I said, just you can sum up his character in the imagery. This is kind of what I was talking about, where it's like you can't necessarily say that the movie fully lies on Mitchum and his performance because the imagery is telling this story just as well by itself. Like you could almost do the whole like the movies that were told in just images, like the short films. You could probably tell this story like that, and a lot of the feel would still be there because it's insane. And like I said, this is kind of countered a little bit. Like it's not too overbearing because in between we do have like the spoons in particular. Like there's all kinds of townspeople on the side, but the spoons in particular kind of have these little comedy interludes just when it's getting like really really dark. And while that would normally seem like out of place, the fact that the characters have been so integrated into the story already kind of just feels like it's a nice balance to make sure we don't get too far into the bleak without that completely overtaking it. Because obviously at the very end, we do learn that there's a more hopeful side to the story. We just have to get there through this. And it's like to kind of set up, like the characters like the spoons and stuff like that kind of set up that whole... It's not... It kind of gives us the clue that it's not going to be completely dark and bleak, despite the directions we're going to go may make it feel that way, especially with how far it goes. But the balance is great. But then, of course, once we do lose Willa, we basically are seeing the movie through, almost strictly, through the perspective of the two kids, which is a very interesting place to be in a movie like this when you're dealing with a serial killer. So we have moments that do genuinely feel almost like a child's view of terror, where we have scenes like when they're in the basement, like or when he's at the top of the basement steps and he's like calling down to them, will always be one of the scariest things ever. But then there's like the reverse of that when it's it leads to an almost slapstick kind of moment. But there's that moment when they're running up the steps and he's running after them and he's got his arms stretched out and he looks like a B-movie monster of sorts. And like I said, while it does have a genuinely scary factor to it, it does also kind of have that feel of when you if you were to ask a child what they'd be afraid of or what kind of things they'd be afraid of, like obviously not just children but everybody at some point has been afraid of a basement, and it's like, what would you, if you were to ask a child in particular, like what would you be afraid of if you went into the basement? And the image is probably not too far away from Mitchum running up the steps at them with his arms outstretched. And the fact to be able to bring that kind of imagery to life in a story like this is really impressive. The way they actually managed to pull it off in this really great way. Where, like I said, the imagery pretty much speaks for itself if you even took a lot of the dialogue out. But then, yeah, talking about more about how it's shot and how it kind of has an almost storybook-like look to it. Like how a lot of the sets are so obviously fake. Like when we see the sky, the night sky when they're like on the boat. But it still looks incredible. Like that's what draws you in, is the way that it looks. And there's even like the way the light is kind of there, like for a split second, kind of makes it look like it's almost in color by the way it's lit. Um, and then we get like the shot where it's when they sleep in the barn, and we see the moon move to show the time passing throughout the night. Um, Before he reappears again in the distance, and all we hear is his singing voice, and it's like I said, it's so hard to even really describe the imagery in this because of just how well it's executed. And like I said, as far as it feeling almost storybook like, it does almost feel like it's sort of like a terrifying bedtime story. Like this whole thing of them being on the boat and being chased from a distance by him almost feels like its own sort of scary bed. It's either a scary bedtime story, or maybe even more so, it's like if you were to be told a scary bedtime story right before you went to sleep, what you see in the movie is the nightmare that you would have afterwards, provoked by that story. And that's, like I said, whenever a movie can actually visually capture the nightmarish feel, there's just nothing else like that to me. Like, I cannot get enough of that. And it's so... And there's so many cases where you can see, like, an attempt at an execution in other movies like that, and it never quite gets there, and you can see, like, you can imagine what it probably could have been or what they were going for, but it's never quite there. And then there's that rare movie, like this one and others, that can really, really capture that feel as far as visually goes. And like I said, there's even that moment when, as he sees him as John sees him in the distance again after they've been sleeping most of the night, John's response is, does he ever sleep? Like, does he even sleep at all? And it's like, there's kind of a comedic factor there a little bit, that that John's just so exasperated at this point by the chase. But once again, it's also completely terrifying, because it's like, if he doesn't sleep, that does give that feel again. It's like, he's almost something paranormal. And it's crazy. And then we kind of get to the final part of this, when they meet Lily and Gish. Who obviously we know all the way back from, like, the very, like, the silent era. Like, if you go back to, like, film history as far back as it'll go, she'll be one of the first faces that you can really see and recognize. And to be here now is kind of like the savior, where I can see it being a bit jarring, because once they meet Lily and Gish, it is almost like they walk into an entirely different movie. But it does at the same time feel like they sort of walk into a sanctuary that takes us out of that nightmarish feel that the rest of it was. And then when he comes back, it's like having that sanctuary invaded by this figure. Like, there's a lot of time in the third portion of the movie here where he does feel more like a figure than a person at this point. And it's like, I guess you could say demonic of sorts. And so we get that moment when she decides she's going to stand up for them and hold him off with her rifle. And it's that image alone of her just sitting on the porch with the rifle practically looks like a painting. But at the same time, I love the way that when he's outside and he's singing again. But of course, that singing has been such a sort of scary force. Like, it's almost like the calling card, like it's to say, like, danger is coming and it's impending or whatever, and it's coming for you specifically. To have her start to sing over him is almost like it's like we're watching an exorcism almost. As she starts to sing over him and overpower his words and overpower his voice, before this final very brief confrontation happens, that ultimately takes him down. And that scene is so incredible in regards to it's almost like a battle, like that love versus hate, good versus evil, the whole thing, the whole setup of the whole thing. We're actually seeing that through the power of song. And it's insane, but it's really incredible. So now, once that confrontation happens, and it's pretty much just alluded to the fact, yeah, he's going to be hung, by the way. It's almost like his comeuppance is almost an afterthought. Because we're moving on to this final portion where suddenly we're in a Christmas movie in the last 5 minutes. And once again, I can see that being really, really jarring to people. But I do think the thing that makes that stand out, and the reason that it does work, is the whole idea of setting it in this Depression era, and the fact that the whole thing is set up by these are people that kind of live in desperate times, resorting to various ways of desperation. So it's like it's just as much about that and like finding a comfortable place without having to live in desperation. That it's to see the kids go from one place to the other kind of feels like it wraps sort of everything up, because if it wasn't for that desperation, the money wouldn't have been involved. Harper at the beginning would have never been executed, so they never would have lost their father or their mother. Harry Powell would have never come into their lives. So the whole kind of thing set this off. So it almost feels like a whole wrapping up of them just not having to necessarily live desperately. Is kind of wraps that whole sort of story up and kind of gives them like this fresh start. Where we've completely left the bleak world that was the first over an hour of this movie behind. After Pal has been taken out of this whole thing. And we've basically taken what may as well have been the devil himself out of this story. And everything can live happily. So I do think it works. I can understand if the execution's a little jarring, because it does feel like we're watching the end of what was essentially a Happy Christmas movie. At the end of this story we've just seen. So, yeah, that's pretty much, I think, how I feel about Night of the Hunter. Now, going on to Cape Fear, what's interesting about Mitchum being in both Cape Fear and the original is the fact that there are a few people from the original, all very recognizable faces, that are in this one in very small roles, with not only Mitchum, but also Gregory Peck and Martin Balsam as well. And the thing about that, of course, is the sort of irony of course, Mitchum was Max Cady originally. So now in Cape Fear, in Scorsese's Cape Fear, he is law enforcement, which is amazing. And he may not be the most honest law enforcement, given some of the things that he kind of hints at that Nick Nolte could be doing, but still law enforcement regardless. That's enough of an opposite for me to see the humor in it. And of course, Gregory Peck, who was Bowden originally, is now representing Cady in court. So there's that. So bravo Scorsese for that. So talking about Max Cady, especially if you want to compare him to Harry Powell, apart from them just being Bible quoting, stalking, psychopathic killers, I almost feel like Max Cady in this movie is basically if everybody in The Night of the Hunter knew what Harry Powell was, but just couldn't do anything about it. If he were to just wander around and everybody knew that he was evil and that he was doom incarnate wherever he was, that's basically what it feels like. And he even has that same sort of almost supernatural vibe where he could just literally be anywhere. Like anywhere Nolte turns, De Niro's going to be in a crowd or on the wall in the backyard, and there's nothing that can be done about it legally. So I do love how they're comparable in that sense also. But as far as how Scorsese handled this, and talking about how it's sort of a bit more interesting than its original source, that would be the whole anti-hero vibe, whereas when we have a case in The Night of the Hunter of clear, like the whole thing, the whole idea is love versus hate, good versus evil. Scorsese's version of Cape Fear is much more of a gray area because of Bowden's character and the way he's treated now. Where he's, in true Scorsese fashion, he's got a complexity about him, I guess you could say, because before Cady is even really the biggest problem here, there is so much going on with this family, particularly the fact that Nolte it could be our hero, but he has been a bit dishonest in the past and potentially now, and the fact that whereas in The Night of the Hunter they were stuck in the Depression, which gave them no choice but to be in the position they were in, and all these events happened out of their control. Arguable in Harper's case of robbing the bank and all that, but it was a desperate times call for desperate measures thing. But you can get a sense of why the characters did what they did, even if it's not necessarily the moral thing. But here, there's no gray area at all. You can't say, well, I understood why they did this. Bowden has affairs, and he is playing up that he doesn't remember Katie and doesn't know why Katie would be after him, when obviously he buried evidence. So in a way, you can see where we have two characters here, where this is not necessarily where one is kind of made by the other, but at the same time, Max Cady does almost feel like he was evil incarnate to begin with anyway. Because while there is the sense of, oh, was Katie ever capable of, like there was the whole questioning of if Bowden hadn't buried the evidence, would Katie have been fine or whatever. But as we learn, Max Cady is obviously should be in prison. He should be locked away forever. It's even to the point when he gets out of prison and he like starts walking towards the camera, like all the way up to the camera, and there's a storm behind him. It is literally a case of a storm is coming. And we don't just get the sense of this is a guy. I mean, you could take this. This is a guy that has been wronged by this one particular person that he's going after, but this is the wrong person to feel wronged. Because the kind of shit that they will do in retaliation is the shit that happens in this movie. So, when you look at that, I do like that it's not even 10 minutes into this movie when a lot of this is already established. Because we established the relationships between Nolte and Jessica Lange, between both of them and Juliette Lewis, and how she's kind of the stereotypical teenage daughter that just wants to stay in her room and she resents them, which is going to absolutely come back to haunt all of them eventually, because she's going to be attracted to what her parents are against, though she may not immediately see the gravity to that. So once we established all of that, we also have his first interaction with them, even if they don't realize that's what it is. When they're in the theater watching Problem Child, of all things, because it had just come out, I guess it had come out the year before this did. And Katie comes in and he lights the cigar and does that whole thing, and he terrorizes them before they realize they're specifically being targeted. Which is very interesting. It's one of those, like, it's such a petty enough attack that it's a great starting point, a jumping off point for the way he's going to work his way into their lives very slowly, it's so incredibly meticulous how he takes it step by step and just slightly further and further each time, before it goes full on, almost practically horror movie. There's like so much build up to that, but the fact that it all starts not even 10 minutes in, but the build up is just that well done, is really perfect. And obviously that shot of him on the wall with the fireworks behind him is, like I said, so incredibly... It's like the stuff in Night of the Hunter. You don't know whether to bask in its beauty or how horrific it is. But they both work, regardless. So, talking about the portion of the movie where we don't quite know the facts just yet is very interesting as well, where it sets up it sets up two different kinds of scary as it reveals the information to us. Because when we start off, and he and Katie finally confront each other face to face, and he's playing up that he doesn't remember Katie, he doesn't remember the case, he doesn't remember what all went down. If that were to have been the case, it would have been a very scary concept, because it would have been the idea of he's, gone through so many cases and put so many people away and done all this stuff, where he even talks about, like, he can't go against the law because the law is his business. To go on the idea of this person is harassing you and coming after you and potentially putting you in danger for a reason that you can't remember. But they've been in prison for like 14 years and it's all they've been thinking about. Something that you have forgotten, and something that they've been stewing on and are ready to come after you for over a decade. And it's that in itself would have been a scary enough concept. But then, of course, it's revealed that Bowden remembers all of this very vividly and what exactly happened. And as far as, like, the law goes, Bowden was not exactly in the right. So that sets up a whole thing of knowing that the main character is fully guilty of what the dangerous person is accusing him of. Now it's a whole other scenario. Now it's a whole other set of stakes, and now it feels like pretty much all bets are off at this point. And of course, the thing about Katie that makes him very interesting, especially through this De Niro performance, this Oscar-nominated De Niro performance, is that and a lot of people. There's a lot of people I know that don't really care for that nomination. They think De Niro's like way too over the top and way too hammy, and the Southern accent is a bit much. I love De Niro in this, like all kinds of De Niro in this. I love the charming Max Cady and the potentially threatening Max Cady and overblown slasher movie Max Cady. I love all the De Niros that are on display here. But here, like in his scenes with Ileana Douglas in particular, where we kind of get to see how how he probably got to the point of, because he's established in such a freaky way at the start, where we see like all the stuff on the walls of his cell, and we see like the Bible verses tattooed on him, and the working out and all that. And he's just kind of immediately threatening, to the point that at first glance you wouldn't think he'd be the kind of guy that's capable of just charming somebody immediately. So this scene with Orlando Dogs immediately shows us, oh, he can put on a facade very easily. That comes off very quickly when the time comes. When he eventually takes a whole chunk out of her face. But that just kind of shows that not only is like the stalking and like the steps of starting with him like killing the dog and stuff like that, because that's always the first step. It's unfortunate for dogs in horror movies. It's a bad thing. But the thing is that when you see that he can also be charming like that, there's just layers to how dangerous he is, because he can be dangerous in so many different ways. And obviously, we're just kind of getting a little taste, like the Ileana Douglas thing kind of gives us the start of it for what is essentially setting up his interactions with Juliette Lewis later. The fact that he can put on that facade and seem like just this southern charming guy and stuff like that. Not to mention the fact that not only has he been spending all of his prison time stewing and ready to take revenge for everything that happened, he's also been educating himself. So that's another layer that Bowden's not expecting, where when he put this guy in jail, he was totally and completely uneducated and basically a complete fucking dangerous idiot. But now he has been so, and not only is it just, through a self-education, but through so many years of it, he's in a pretty good place at this point to where he is now extra threatening, more so than he was when he went in. So, like, he's everything dangerous that he was when he went in, but now he's got revenge on his mind that's been brewing for over a decade, and he's now significantly smarter. So that whole setup is just brilliant, and the way De Niro is able to play all these different facets is perfect. Like, I really love it. I don't even care. So, and that's kind of thing. That's another comparison you can throw up to Harry Powell. Also, the whole how you can definitely see the different facades of when he's with the kids, when he's with Pearl at the start in particular, when he's with Will, or when he's with the Spoons or whatever. He's just mingling with the townspeople, and it's like, it's a little obvious because we know the facade, like when he's fake crying after Willa disappears. Max Cady is like completely into, like, you always get lost in De Niro in the scenes when he's like charming people, and it's and that makes him all the more scary and dangerous and stuff like that. And so, yeah, and some of the things here that are kind of in the background are like perfectly placed throughout. Like we were talking about how the family already had problems, and he had affairs and stuff like that were going on. But it's like, once Cady kind of starts to integrate himself into this, a fight breaks out about one of his potential affairs. And it's like, in any other case, you would be thinking like, okay, why is this happening now? Like, of all this stuff with Cady going on, why are we going to argue about this exactly in this particular moment? And it's really just this case of just the result of increased tensions. Like, it's like, these are tensions that were already here and were already boiling. And so, like, instead of Cady just kind of coming in and taking over entirely, he's, like, boiling the water more. Before it gets much more blown up in regards to what he's capable of doing and what exactly he is what he's going to do and when. Like, how long is he going to wait before he does the next level of extreme. And that's kind of the whole main factor of what's hooks you in so much about the movie is what is going to be the next level that Katie is going to go, because he's so meticulously playing this out clearly in regards to how he's going to get into them. So this is about the time when he gets to Juliette Lewis, and who was also nominated for this. And I believe this scene where they meet on the stage was probably the main selling point of how they both got their Oscar nominations. This was kind of the scene that sold that to the voters. And what's interesting about this scene is, actually before that scene even happens, when he calls her, that whole moment where he's like hanging upside down and we kind of turn around and show him right side up while he's still hanging. And it's like, it just makes him, even though he's being so charming, like we saw earlier, it's like the combination of the two things. Because he's using his charming voice and he's charming her, and we believe that. But yet, the way he's shot in this scene makes him look so feral. It's such a great combination of the two things, because it plays perfect into the fact that he can charm with just his voice when he's not face to face and when she can't see him. And it's like, it's kind of showing the phone voice is the facade, and what we're actually seeing is the actual him. It's like a full-on visual representation of what we saw in the early Anna Douglas scene. So when they actually get to the scene on the stage, and this back and forth happens, what's so interesting about this is the fact that he's doing so well, like kind of disguising himself, but at the same time, she figures out immediately who he is. But it doesn't completely scare her off. And that's what makes the scene so weird and tense and electrifying, though. And the fact that this scene goes the direction that it goes is kind of even more unexpected. Even with her being the rebellious daughter, it still like brings on this whole other level of he is now hooked onto this family in a way, in like the last way they would have wanted. Where like this is kind of the final moment into we're getting into extreme action will have to be taken, because now he's gotten to where somebody on the family is now on his side. And that's about the worst place we can get now, apart from having two people on his side. But thankfully, we don't have to worry about getting there, because the Joe Don Baker comes in and we kind of get our double climax. But even before that, there is a great scene that really shows off how amazing of a character Katie is, this particular incarnation of Katie, where we get the scene where he's going to have Katie attacked by these few guys after he and Robert Mitchum have discussed it. And the thing about it is, with a villain this big and threatening, you don't, as late in the movie as this is, it almost seems risky to show your villain as weak. Like with this, in a movie like this late in the game, you normally wouldn't want to show your villain on the ground bleeding because of three random dudes we've never seen before. Because it's like, okay, what's the threat? He's just a dude. But that's kind of the thing, is not only is that scary in itself, but then the way the scene turns and he overpowers all three of them. And talking about him looking weak and compared to this, seeing him beaten, once he's overpowered them and he's looking around for Nolte and calling him out, the wounds that he got from initially being beaten down now make him look even scarier. And it's like that just keeps somehow rolling back into his favor and making him a bigger threat than he was in the scene before, and it just keeps building and building. So we get to our first climax in the house, where Joe Don Baker's waiting out, and they have the bear tied up to the wire. And this scene, where we're just lingering on the bear waiting for it to move, is one of the most tense scenes in at least the 90s. It had to be. Even if it was in the early 90s, it was 91. And there's a lot of tense scenes in the 90s, but waiting for that bear to move, just no matter how many times I see this, is still one of the most intense fucking things ever. But then, of course, this goes entirely wrong. Joe Don Baker ends up dead, and we have to have a second climax. And I feel like at this point might be when some audiences might have gotten a bit lost. Like they kind of like the movie kind of lost them, where it was like it gets a bit too much, where it's like he follows them by holding on to the bottom of the car, and it goes into full slasher mode basically, where he becomes a like horror movie monster by the end of it. By the time they get onto the boat. And I can see where that could lose people, but honestly, I kind of love that it kind of goes full slasher, because it kind of gives it, like, it almost feels like a classic sort of feel. Um, Especially with, I haven't even mentioned the score yet, and how big of a part that plays in it, whether it be the way they build up Katie to when the action gets more and more intense as it goes on. Um, and this is a case where, like, overbearing is almost better, when usually it would be kind of frowned upon. But like I said, this ending goes big in such a way that you may not necessarily expect, especially being especially when you think about Scorsese taking on a movie like this, you almost might expect almost a more artful approach to it. But the fact that he is able to maintain certain aspects of his style and the way he approaches characters, while still going like full-blown horror movie by the end of it, I think that weirdly kind of blends well, even in a way, if it sounds like you may think it wouldn't. But I do feel like he actually had a pretty consistent grasp of this and was aware of the way it was building, to where by the time we do get super over the top, like I said, almost practically a monster movie, especially the way he keeps coming back like a horror movie monster does. I don't know, it works for me, because I think it's kind of perfectly, like, we see the step-by-step process through the whole movie as he gets more and more threatening as he goes, in various different ways. So, yeah, I've always kind of appreciated the ending going big, so maybe that's just me, I don't know. But, yeah, so I do think if I were to, like, have a preference between the two, I've revisited Cape Fear significantly more times, but The Night of the Hunter just really has such a unique feel to it, and a feel that I feel like is missing in a lot of movies that try for it but can't quite get there. So, Cape Fear is something you can go back to just because it's, because of the kind of movie it is, makes it kind of easy to digest, but also has that character work in it and the great performances in it that draw you in, and has that real suspense in it that draws you in. But I mean, if you want like a real full-on experience, that's absolutely in The Night of the Hunter. So I would say, like, if I had to pick one objectively, I would say The Night of the Hunter for sure. So that's pretty much where I land with that, I think. So the next thing is going to be, we're actually going into 3 movies for A Versus, and then we're going into another Stephen King novella. Whichever order those end up in. Oh, and Sandler's new movie, I almost forgot about, which is a great sign. So, yeah, so I think I'm going to end this here, and we'll get to that other stuff. So until that, I think that's it for this.